What's going on, my fellow residents? It's me, the Frozen Cavern, and today I have the next episode of All Things End, Volume 1. And this chapter is going to be Absence of Normalcy. Now, the last one I did got an amazing amount of support, so I'm very happy to do this again. Now, this is actually going to be the first time where I have a female voice, and as you can tell by my deep masculine voice, I obviously won't be able to do that. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to keep that male for now because I am not going to try and stress over that. And once again, Courage fan, I cannot thank you enough for getting this known and spreading this out, but once again, I'd like to say thank you. Now, without further ado, let us begin. Just as he had suspected would happen, the trip downstairs had sapped Courage of what little energy he had left. He may have managed to avoid an attack, but he still felt just as tired. Muriel and Eustace were in the living room, watching TV as they always did. Muriel would be cooking dinner soon, and after that she would do a bit of housework. Then they'd go back to watching TV until it was finally time for bed. Being faced with his own morality, Courage was beginning to notice the odd sort of peace his small family had. Sure, it was often broken up by monster attacks or Eustace's usual greedy antics. He had really taken it for granted all these years. He'd honestly thought, at least in the back of his head, that this would go on forever. He loved his simple life with his simple family on their simple farm. Bad things did happen, sure, but he was willing to put up with it at the cost of having a life like this. Even the fact that they were living in the literal middle of nowhere wasn't so bad to him anymore. He really was going to miss it. He moved across the room, completely ignored by his owners. He laid next to Muriel's chair inside. She still wasn't noticing him, but he was glad to get some rest right beside her anyway. He didn't have the energy to worry right now, and he didn't want to think about the things he had learned either. He let out another wistful sigh and buried his muzzle deeper into his paws. "Oh, Courage, I didn't see you come down," Muriel spoke, causing him to jump. It had been days since he had last spoke directly to him like that. He gazed up at her and gave her a quizzical look. "It's nearly 6. Let's go make supper," she said, patting him on his head. It left him completely stunned. She was actually talking to him again? Maybe he looked so miserable now that she couldn't bear to ignore him anymore. Part of him wanted to rest, but the other part of him was desperate to try and prove to her that he was still the proper, not sick Courage that he was. Stifling a whimper, he followed her into the kitchen. His entire body shook with the effort. It left him cringing at his inability to function properly. How could he possibly act normal around Muriel when his entire body rebelled against his efforts? "Courage," she called out to him. His weakness must have been obvious because she was gazing worriedly down at him. He gave her a meek grin that spoke the words, "I'm alright," but he really wasn't, at least not on the inside. He clambered up onto a chair and watched as Muriel set things up for dinner. She kept glancing over at him with a worried expression, and he did his absolute best to wag his tail and smile at her whenever she did. He didn't want to worry her, and that was the best he could do in his current predicament. As he watched Muriel, he began to realize that there was even more evidence of his impending fate. She had been constantly making him his favorite foods almost every night since the veterinarian visit. Tonight she was serving up his favorite kind of dumplings with those happy plums as dessert. He almost couldn't will himself to eat once he realized what was going on. His stomach lurched with anxiety as Muriel finished her cooking and set the table. He wanted to excuse himself from the kitchen, but the worried look she kept giving him left him with no choice but to stay and eat. Things only managed to get even worse when Eustace joined them. He didn't yell at him for sitting at the table, or even for sitting in a spot. That was something that would have normally earned him a shove off the chair, or worse. They all ate in silence. Eustace was so buried in his newspaper that he often missed his bowl completely as he brought his spoon down into it. Muriel was refusing to look up from her own bowl, too. The eerie silence was so painful that it only made Courage's stomach lurch even harder as he ate. He wished that he could go anywhere but there right now, but he knew that he would only worry Muriel even more if he left. He was so desperate for some kind of normalcy that he actually gave Eustace a pitiful look and got up from the chair, taking his food with him. He dumped his dish into his dog bowl and looked back up, half expecting Eustace to move back into his usual spot. The old farmer did nothing. He simply kept ignoring everything around him. He flipped through another page of his newspaper and missed his bowl for what seemed like the millionth time. Courage could have ripped his ears out in frustration. The food didn't sit well with him after that. Things were so uncanny and so unnatural that it only made him feel even worse when he tried to make them right. He wished more than anything that his life could just go back to normal. Why did he have to get sick? Sighing pitifully, he left the kitchen. He couldn't bear to sit through another second of that terrible silence. He jumped into Muriel's chair, curled up, and finally managed to get that nap he needed. Muriel did the dishes while Eustace flipped through the channels on the TV. Courage told the old man grumble a couple times, enough to wake him out of his sleep, but the farmer did nothing else, and he certainly didn't notice or even care about the dog lying in his wife's chair. It was like Courage didn't exist at all. and it took a lot of effort for him to not be bothered by it or to be able to just go back to sleep. He wasn't sure how long he managed to rest, but he was soon woken up by Muriel gently shaking him. He sat up, blinked, and let out a loud yawn. He assumed that she wanted her spot back, so he got up to jump down, but she instead picked him up. "Would you like to help me with the laundry, Courage?" she asked, smiling at him. He replied, nodding with enthusiasm. The truth was that he was dreading another long walk down a staircase, but he was willing to put up with it, only for Muriel. He was going to try and not act sick. This was the perfect time for him to prove to her that he was really alright. Despite his fear, he let his tail wag with joy. He was just happy that Muriel wasn't ignoring him anymore. Unfortunately, his joy was quickly diffused by the sheer effort that it took to follow her down into the basement. It ended up being just as bad as he had feared. The pain and exhaustion he experienced was nigh unbearable. He was panting by the time he made it down the staircase, weakly clutching at his chest. So much for trying not to act sick. It was a good thing that Muriel was too busy with her load of laundry to notice him gasping for air. He sat down on the bottom step and watched as Muriel switched the laundry over. This was something that was normal for a change, something that he had always wanted for as long as he could remember. He had always followed Muriel down into the basement, even when this place had always scared him as a puppy. He couldn't help but wonder if he would eventually get too sick to follow her around like this, and he shuddered at the thought of it. Muriel almost seemed to sense his worried thoughts. She turned and began to talk to him as she folded up a few cloths. "Courage, you're a wonder, you are. Remember when we first met? You were just a wee puppy, lost and all alone. I'm sure you missed your parents very much. I hope that I've always been a good substitute for them." She sounded so sad. He hated to think about all the pain he was causing her. "Arufu," he replied in this dog speak, trying to reassure her with a pleasant smile. He could feel his eyes stinging with tears, but he forced them back because he didn't want her to see. He wished that he could thank her for everything she had done for him. He could have been left in that alleyway to rot, and yet she still took him in. And his parents. That was another thing he was left to ponder over. His parents were still out there somewhere, supposedly still alive. Wherever they had been taken to in space, surely they were still alive out there. He had never gotten a chance to save them, and now there was no way he could possibly do anything for them. He'd never see them again. Muriel began humming that little tune she often used while working around the house. It was a song that Courage had listened to her sing for as long as he had lived on the farm. For a single moment, everything felt real. Memories of all the happy times he had spent on the farm filled his mind. He couldn't help but wonder why this happy little life with Muriel and Husis had to end. He fought back even more tears now. He was scared to lose this all, to lose his own life, to lose everything he had ever known, to lose Muriel, to lose even his own parents. He hoped dearly that Computer would come through for him in the end. He hated to think about what would happen if he didn't. The thought of Computer possibly telling him that he needed to give up and accept the inevitable left him shivering in terror. "Alright, Courage, time to take these upstairs," Muriel cheerfully spoke. Her words managed to pull him out of his thoughts. He nodded happily in reply, but cringed on the inside. He didn't know how he was going to make it up all those stairs this time. He had to mentally prepare himself for the pain that he knew was coming, but even then it wasn't going to be enough. He wished that he could get across to her that he wanted to ride up, but if he did, he knew that it would be an acknowledgement of his own illness. As they walked over to the stairs, Muriel continued to speak. "All things come to an end, Courage. It's just a natural part of life. Even our happy little existence on this farm will one day come to an end. This doesn't mean it has to be a bad thing, though. Nothing stays the same forever." Courage nodded. He felt even worse knowing why she was saying that, and it was hard to think that he might not have even known what was going on if he hadn't gone to Computer for help. He wanted to feel like Muriel had betrayed him, but he knew deep down that she was only doing what she felt was best for him. She wanted to make sure that he wouldn't have to suffer in the end, even if putting him down would hurt them all just as much as waiting would. His vision had gone blurry again, and he had to wipe his eyes when Muriel wasn't looking. All things end, huh? He wished it didn't have to be so. "But now, let's just enjoy the time we have," Muriel said. Her voice was growing sad and weary again, much to Courage's dismay. Somehow he made it up the staircase, his chest burning with agony. He had to crawl up the last few steps and was left panting so loudly that half of nowhere could properly hear him. He had given up trying to pretend that he was alright. He didn't want to worry Muriel, yes, but he just couldn't fight off his own exhaustion anymore. And then it happened. It started out the way it always did, a tingling sensation in his chest growing worse and worse. Then came the shortness of breath. He began to gasp in a desperate attempt to get enough air into his lungs. He placed a paw up against his chest as the tingling grew into a horrible stabbing pain. It felt like someone had jabbed a knife into him and was twisting it all around. He let out a weak cry and toppled to the floor. Writhing in pain, he was barely getting enough air into his lungs to keep himself from passing out. He kept a single paw all but buried into his chest. It was almost as if he could claw the pain out if he tried hard enough. Despite the vicious buzzing in his ears, he heard Muriel shout, "Oh no. Eustace! It's happening to him again!" He caught a glimpse of the old farmer running into the kitchen from the living room. He was forced to snap his eyes shut again as the pain overwhelmed him. He let out another cry of agony. He knew that they couldn't help him, but in the throes of an attack, the primal desire to escape his pain overrode all other senses. For one horrible moment, he almost wished the vet really would come in and stab a needle into his arm. He envisioned Muriel grabbing a butcher knife and stabbing him through the heart, finally ending his pain. He would have done anything to escape. Not even his fear of dying could overcome his desire to end the pain. "Don't touch him! Doctor said it'll only make things worse," he heard Eustace say to Muriel. His vision began to grow a hazy red, not that he could keep his eyes open for more than a few seconds anyway. The pain was somehow getting even worse. He continued to writhe on the floor, crying out every time he finally managed to get some air into his lungs. His mind was growing foggy and the world around him was falling away. Finally, his vision went black and unconsciousness took him. It felt like hours had passed before he woke up again. Thankfully, it seemed that only a couple of minutes had really gone by. He could feel Muriel's warm arms wrapped around him, and he opened his eyes, unsurprised to find that his vision was blurry and still unfocused, just like they always were after an attack. He could barely make out the look on Muriel and Eustace's faces. "What can we do? He's hurting so badly," Muriel asked. Her voice was filled with a mixture of fear and sorrow. The old farmer scratched the back of his head in dismay. "We can't do anything for him. Doctor said so, didn't he? We just gotta wait until Friday, I guess." Muriel nearly dropped courage in her outrage. "You want them to do it, don't you? How can you want them to do something like that to poor Courage? You're an evil man, you are!" She plopped the bleary-eyed pup down onto the kitchen table in frustration. He whined softly at her, but she ignored him. He really didn't want them to fight. She tried to choke out several more insults, but instead broke down and began to sob. She opened her mouth to say something else, but nothing came out. Burying her face in her arms, she stormed out the back door. Eustace outstretched an arm as if to stop her, but she was already gone. "That ain't it, Muriel." "That ain't it at all," he murmured. Courage looked up at him. His mind was finally starting to clear up, and he began to wonder what the old farmer might try to do next. Eustace looked down at him and scowled. "Dumb dog, why do you have to go and get sick? Muriel isn't happy when you're not around." He shook his head in anger and then glanced back over at the open door. "Muriel," he murmured out a second time. Without missing another beat, the old farmer took off out the door in search of his wife. Courage couldn't remember the last time Eustace had looked so worried about anything except losing money. Gathering what little strength he could manage, he decided to follow his owners. Slowly and shakily, he made his way off the kitchen table and out into the night air. He could find neither of the old couple. Wondering that something might have happened, he noticed that the door to the barn had been left slightly ajar. He headed over to it and braced himself for the worst. Peering inside, he blinked with surprise at what he saw. Muriel was sitting on a haystack with a handkerchief pressed beneath her glasses, and Eustace was standing beside her, saying something that Courage couldn't hear. They were both talking in an inaudible low whisper, but he was glad to see that they weren't fighting anymore. Eustace sat down and they both talked for a very long time. Courage was finding it very hard not to topple over in exhaustion as he waited. He never thought that he'd see a day where just standing around would tire him out so much. As their conversation went on, Muriel shook her head and said something that Courage still couldn't pick up. Eustace said something back to her, looking surprisingly concerned, and then a long silence followed. Eustace finally reached over and placed a hand onto hers, gently smiling as if to reassure her of something. She smiled back with a renewed vigor that Courage hadn't seen since before he had been taken to the vet. Then, something happened that he had not seen once in all the time he had lived on the farm. Eustace pulled Muriel into a hug. Courage had to pick his jaw up from off the ground. Never once had he seen that greedy, angry old farmer show love for anything except his money. It left the poor dog flabbergasted and questioning if he really was awake. This couldn't be real. Could it? "That's why I married you. Remember?" the old man clarified. His voice echoed through the barn, just loud enough for Courage to hear. "I thought you had forgotten," Muriel answered, her voice forlorn. Even if the dog does, well, you know, I promise I'll still be here for you. Well, so long as you keep making me dinner. Dinner, huh? Now what would a grumpy old man like you do without me? She laughed. Courage turned away. He decided that it would be best to leave. He didn't want to see the old couple start kissing or something gross like that. And he also felt like he was intruding in on something that he had no right to be a part of. He was happy for the both of them, but he was also facing the grim reality of what was going on. They were preparing for his permanent absence. He whimpered softly to himself. Exhausted and lonely, he did not head back into the house, but instead walked over to the front porch. He sat down and stared up at the stars, quietly wondering if his parents were looking down on him from up there. Part of him desperately wanted to go visit Computer just so that he wouldn't have to be alone right now. Unfortunately, he already knew that the machine wouldn't want him around. Computer didn't make for good company anyway, that much he knew all too well. He was also worried that the machine might already have an answer for him, and he wasn't willing to deal with the shock of either outcome right now. Frustrated, he buried his head into his paws. It was his turn to cry now. He was alone in dealing with his own demise, and he hated every moment of it. Muriel and Huses didn't understand, and Computer most certainly wouldn't understand either. He was completely alone in facing the illness ravaging his body, and he knew deep down that he'd probably be facing that needle all alone too.